Do you know anything about the legality of uploading mixes? I recently produced a track in the style of the early 94s to 96s. That's a very specific date range. Music production is fun and all, but how did you manage to talk a girl to get married? Have any of the boutique microsynths taken your fancy? Covered in bees? Is it the digital equivalent of Eurocrack? Is there any difference between putting a reverb directly on a sound at a low wetness versus putting a reverb on a separate track? Hey guys, welcome to the Kane audio vlog. It's Friday. It's time for another Ask Me Anything. Usual rules apply. Ask me anything you want below this video and I'll get back to you in next week's video. Before I look at last week's video, is there any house admin? For the life of me, I cannot remember what I've even done this week. What did we say last week? Oh, yeah, that's right. Lots of IDs in a row went up for Mousetrap for their Mixcloud Select. That's cool, go check that out. Otherwise, if you are a member of my Patreon community, then you will also have access to it there. And on that note of my Patreon community, link below this video, I think it says something like support more of these videos here or something. Click on that link and it's all there. But if you are a member of the Patreon community, then you will have had a video yesterday, 2 days ago, some point this week, which is the first of the Hackintosh series, where I go through the parts list, kind of explaining why I've chosen those parts and what I'm aiming for. And then episode 2 will be coming somewhat soon, and I will be comparing that price-wise and power-wise to various Macs and whatever. So that's all going forward. I believe that is it for house admin. I can't think of anything else. As usual, I'm completely unprepared for these, but that's kind of the format of these videos, I suppose, so deal with it. Right, so looking at last week's video, starting at the top, Ricky John, Hive, high five. Following on from talking about DJing and 2-hour compilations, do you know anything about the legality of uploading mixes? Can anyone just put together an hour of her favourite songs and shove it on SoundCloud, etc., so long as you don't make money off it? Have a good weekend. You too. So, it's kind of a tricky one. Well, no, it's not tricky. Actually, the official line is, no, you can't do it. You can't. It's someone else's music. It's someone else's copyright. Even if you are putting it up for free. And I'll give you an example where some of these YouTube videos that I do, where I want to use one of my own tracks, because I don't own the copyright to my own tracks. Once it's signed to a record label, the copyright is no longer mine. That's the whole point of signing copyright. So the record label owns the master rights to that track. If I want to use that track in a tutorial or whatever in one of my YouTube videos, I need to get clearance from the publishers, who in most cases are tied in with a record label. So for example, if I sign a track to Mousetrap, you have like a recommended publisher, which is in our interest to sign the publishing rights to that track. If I want to use that track and I'm not making any money, I still need to get what they call a gratis license to be able to broadcast that song publicly, even though I'm not making any money, and even though they're not charging me any money. I still need to get clearance for that. I need their permission to use it. Obviously, when it's my track and my publishing and my copyright, it's very easy to get that clearance. So that's the official stance. You can't do it. It's as simple as that. However, I think there's a tradition, historically. So when I first got into the dance music industry way back when, you'd get sent promo records. They were vinyl back then, and they'd come through your letterbox, and it would say something on there, for promotional use only, not for public broadcast, and something or other, which is kind of basically a get out clause. And so although you weren't allowed to publicly broadcast it, the reason is really, if you played it on a radio show, no one's going to serve you a notice of any kind. They encouraged that, if anything. Same goes for things like a promo mix or a mixtape or whatever. But by having that clause, they basically meant that it meant that if they didn't like what you'd done for whatever reason, then they could go, hey, no, and take it back. So the tradition has always been that record labels just kind of turn a blind eye to promo mixes and DJ mixes and things like that. So it's always been I want to say a grey area. It's not a grey area because, like I said at the beginning, it's not your copyright. You're not allowed. That's the official line. But the unofficial, unwritten rules are, if you're doing it in a mix, you're not giving away the whole track in its entirety, and you're not profiting from it, then most labels will turn a blind eye. However, as a third counterpoint to my own point there, final thing to say on that is DMCA notices. There are, and I know I've covered this before briefly, there are companies out there that you can sign up to, and I assume pay for. A lot of record labels use them, which will basically use bots to crawl the web and search for your tracks and serve a takedown notice or a copyright claim or whatever. So if, for example, you were to put together a mix, a 2-hour-long mix, and you uploaded it to SoundCloud, and my track was in that mix, and I hired, one of those copyright searching companies, then they would scan the internet, they'd find your mix, and they'd serve a takedown notice for the entire mix. So just because one track in that 2-hour mix has a copyright notice, the whole mix has to come down. So that is basically it. There's also, we have slightly different laws in Europe to America, but there are Creative Commons licenses and things like that. Some of it covers music, some of it doesn't. It's just a minefield. Essentially, my personal opinion is, if you're just doing a promo mix and it's a few tracks mixed together, and you're not, like I say, you're not letting people have the entirety of the track, and there's no download option, I think that's somewhat important, that it kind of shouldn't be downloadable, because it just makes it easier for people to edit the track out and use it as though it was a single, and I think it's a bit morally different. It's not wrong, but it's just different. So I think if it was just a streaming thing, so looking at something like Mixcloud, and you credit the artist in the track list, then personally I don't have an issue. I mean, personally, for any of you guys watching this using my tracks in promo mixes, again, bearing in mind I don't own the whole copyright, so what I say is kind of irrelevant, really. But I will say, from an artistic point of view, I consider it a compliment when people use my tracks in their mixes. So that's my personal view. There we go. I think that answers everything. Silent Warrior. Hello, Dom. There is one thing that has been bothering me for a long time. I recently produced a track in the style of the early 94s to 96s. That's a very specific date range. No 50 FX sounds, no polished drums, etc. Simply this raw sound. Also, the BPM was at 160. Why does nobody today produce this lively, hypnotic, rough sound? Dream Crasher, Forest Dream, Nostrum, Brainchild. Was that 160 Nostrum, Brainchild? Could have been. Jones and Stevenson, the first Rebirth. There's no way that was 160, was it? Everyone misses it, but no one produces it, and no label publishes something like that. I know so many people who wish there would be more such music coming back. Best regards, Carlo. So yeah, that's a good question. I think it's one of those genres that, I mean, as you say, it was the 94s to 96s. I can't confirm that. I can't remember that. The 90s were a bit more hazy for me. But yeah, I get what you're saying. I think you'll probably be somewhat pleasantly surprised over the next couple of years, because I feel like at the moment there's a bit of a resurgence where we've had the resurgence of deep house using the 909 drums, and the whole tech house thing has really used the 909 drums and that sort of old school flavour. I could be wrong here, but I feel like there's a bit of an undercurrent of some old school breaksy stuff starting to creep in. There certainly is in my tracks, and there have been for a while now on the ones that I've been writing. And from listening to feedback, I've heard people sort of suggest similar. So it wouldn't surprise me if it makes a little bit, somewhat of a resurgence, but in a more modern twist, I suppose. For me, 160 BPM is very fast. It wouldn't surprise me if maybe that's partly to do with it. Let's be super blunt and realistic here. In the mid-90s, the club scene was different, and let's be really blunt, the drugs were probably different. Nowadays, it's a bit more egotistical and self-reflective. So I feel like 160 BPM might not work today, not like it did back then. So I would say it's probably the BPM that throws people the most. However, I would say if everyone misses it but no one produces it and no labels publish it, then get on that. Start your own label. Do it. Start making it. There we go. And I can see you have posted a link to one of your tracks below that, so if anyone's interested, then they can feel free to click that. Moving on, Zombo. Music production is fun and all, but how did you manage to talk a girl to get married, and tips on how to talk to girls, lol. Thanks and have a great weekend. I'm probably the last person to get tips on things like that from. I managed it just by sheer luck, basically. Yeah, just play the numbers game. I think that's my advice. That's not my advice. I don't know. Just be yourself. Oh, God, that's cheesy. I don't know. I'm just going to avoid that and move on. Sorry. Andrew Hollis. Hi, Dom. High five. Always thought that was way too expensive, but just seen they've been lowered their prices somewhat. Yeah, so talking about Hive, yeah, I managed to install it, which I was quite impressed with, because I had a quote for a professional install, and I think it was about £300, which seemed like a bit much to plug in a few wires. But yeah, there we go. Yeah, the prices have come down considerably. I've been watching it. Slight side tangent here. Believe it or not, I'm a bit of a nerd, and I like smart home stuff. So clearly, as you can see with all of these things, everything's sort of wired up to to be voice activated in this house, whether it be lights, kettles, and now heating. And yeah, I've been watching the Hive thing for years, and I was always torn between Nest and Hive, and Nest got bought out by Google, I think, which is always a bad sign, because Google seem to buy these things and then do nothing with it and then discontinue it, which I think is what happened to Nest. I could be wrong, which is not good for anyone who bought the Nest kit. But yeah, but Hive seems to be running fairly solidly on its own. I think that got bought by Amazon or something, which then ties in with everything. And Amazon don't have that track record that Google have. So yeah, anyway, so I went with Hive, and there we go. I'm quite pleased that I managed to wire it all up. Although, for those of you who are long-time followers of this channel, you will also know that I've been doing a lot of DIY in this house, and you'll be glad to know that to get the Hive heating to work, I had to plug in the hub near the router, and to plug something in near the router, I then had to take a whole new ring and spur off the mains electric to be able to move sockets to even just plug in the hub, which was fun. Anyway, I see Korg have released a micro synth as a kit, NTS1, for around £100. Sounds good, and sounds good too. Have any of the boutique micro synths taken your fancy? I guess a good introduction into hardware if you don't have the space or money. You know what? I have seen several people online in the last couple of weeks mention how good these new mini synths are, and someone also posted something the other day saying, who'd have thought Behringer are making amazing synths? And yeah, so I'm aware that a lot of these new synths are starting to really sound good, and it shouldn't be a surprise when you think of where technology has moved in the last 10 years. You know, if you look at an old 70s analog synth or an 80s analog synth, you know, the wiring of them, the schematics of them, and I mean, yeah, there were PCBs, but everything from schematics onwards was just pretty shoddy, to be honest. I mean, don't get me wrong, that was part of the appeal, and that gave character to these things. Nowadays, you know, we live in a world where microtransistors are cheap and easy to manufacture, so you know, the capabilities of these small synths should be huge these days. So as for recommendations, none of them have really taken my fancy. I always quite liked I think it was the Micro Brute, just as a fun toy synth. I don't want to use the word toy because that makes it sound bad, but yeah, I always fancied that. Aside from that, I always think they're a good recommendation, and as you say, they're a good place to start if you're looking for an introduction to synthesis. For me, I kind of feel like I need full-size synths, because if I'm totally honest, part of the appeal of hardware synths, I don't care if it's analog or digital or hybrid, or I couldn't care less what the architecture is in general, but the biggest selling point of hardware synths for me is the fact that I can play it and touch it and feel it, and it's that tangible thing. And one of the reasons, or probably the biggest selling point of the Moog Sub 37 for me, is the fact that it has so many potentiometers and so many dials and buttons on there. And there is a menu system, but you don't need the menu system when you're just generally designing some sound or playing with some elements of sound, or whatever it is you're doing, some sort of synthesis. You just don't need to be going into menu systems, and everything's there right in front of you. It's brilliantly labeled, and I feel like, aside from the fact that Moog create some of the best sounding synths ever and have some of the most beautiful analog architecture. Even if all of that wasn't true, I would still love the Sub 37 just for its simplicity and ease of use and layout. So there we go. That's my view on that. Nightquaker, lots of questions in a row. Okay. And then someone has commented, Zombo's commented, saying, dude, I saw your YouTube channel. Good stuff. So everybody go check out Nightquaker's YouTube channel. Cavacay, hi Dom, another great AMA. Hive, high five, covered in bees. That's Eddie Izzard reference. Completely agree about Eddie Izzard. It's a shame he doesn't really doing much these days. For me, Bill Bailey and Russell Howard hit the spot. Bill Bailey, I like him as a person from what I know of him. I like some of his rants and tangents that he goes off on. And I like some of the songs that he does. They're very clever and he's very musically clever. But I've always struggled to watch an entire stand-up show of his. I don't know why. I wish I knew the reason and I wish I could get around it because I really do like him, but I don't. I tend to get a bit bored of his stand-up, and I feel bad saying that because I can't think of a reason, and that's bad of me. Anyway, and Russell Howard, yeah, I think similarly actually. Russell Howard, probably the same. I don't know what it is, but there we go. It is what it is. Regarding the project I talked about last week, luckily the brief does include a story. Not much I can reveal at this stage. Fair enough. I've had a think and broken it down into 3 movements, further broken into 8-minute sections for my own benefit. I think that is the best way. We were talking about, I think you had a 2-hour, essentially a 2-hour piece of music to do. And yeah, I think, breaking it down into 3 movements, if you think of the perfect story, narrative, whatever, is your beginning, your middle and end, your introduction and your conflict and your resolution. So you set the plot up, give the plot a big twist, and then bring it a resolution. And if you think of your music in that respect, so your 3 movements, then you've got 3 directions to move the story in, even if it's, like I think I said last week, even if it's only in your head, it doesn't need to have the film to go with it. Do you know what I mean? I think people know what I mean, hopefully. Yeah. So further than breaking into 8-minute sections for my own benefit. So breaking it down into songs basically and song structures. By systems music, I mean some of the stuff done by Steve Reich, Philip Glass and Terry Riley. Okay, makes somewhat sense, although I'm very aware of their work. I'm still not getting the systems bit, but I think I know what you mean. Thanks for your advice. It really has helped a lot. That visualization for your album really paints a picture. I saw it in the animation style of John Hopkins' Emerald Rush video. Interestingly, I gave a copy of the draft version of my album and narrative to a couple of friends so far, and one of them, who is a film director and writer, came back saying he felt like the whole thing should be an animation, which has never occurred to me because I've never thought of making an animation. I've never thought of being involved in a project that consisted of animation. It's not, I won't say I dislike animation because I like a lot of animations, whether it be, Studio Ghibli stuff to the obvious Disney stuff. But it's interesting that you say that, because that makes me think, are other people seeing something that maybe I'm not? I don't know. On the subject of Spitfire, yep, the BBC is expensive, £900 after the promo ends, ouch, and excessive for most of our needs as electronic music producers. Albion 1 is definitely on my wish list, but the Scandi collection is higher up the list for that slightly frozen and fragile sound. Yeah, speaking of frozen, there was another one that they did. What was that? called something Frozen something. That was another good one. Plus Kepler Orchestra for the aforementioned systems music influences. There we go. However, they just released OPW, which is £29, and there's lots of useful stuff in it. I got it, and I'm very glad that I did. I'm trying to include more acoustic sound sources in a hope that it inspires me to finish more stuff. Just to add to what you said about Brexit, the trade deal situation is even worse than that because we don't have competent trade deal negotiators, as that had all been handled by the EU for decades. So we need to recruit them and familiarise them with the intricacies of the UK economy before negotiations can even start. That's very, very true, and a very, very horrific truth at that. 7 years to a Canada Plus deal is a pipe dream. Bozo, Farage, Rees-Mogg, Eyal are manipulating the public opinion and spreading FUD in a cynical attempt to line their own pockets by betting against the UK's economy. Boy, are they doing that. This week in the news we've had the government posting a doctored video, and the subject is their political opposition. Let's be honest, that's basically the legal definition of propaganda. We've also had Rees-Mogg calling the victims of a fire, claiming that they didn't use any common sense and that he would, and someone came out in his defence basically saying, well, Rees-Mogg is just more intelligent than you. And we've had the Russian interference paper has been suppressed, along with the financial forecasts have been suppressed as well, all in the week of a general election campaign launch. So there we go. If that's not treason, I don't know what is. Just my opinion, of course. As you can probably tell, I'm fuming about the situation. I can tell. I can also hear that my baby is crying downstairs, so I'm just going to check that everything's all right. Back in a sec. There we go. Fresh brew. Do you know what? He's an amazing baby. He actually rarely cries. Eats amazing, sleeps amazing. Everything's amazing. But it seems that every Friday during the filming of these AMAs, that's when he decides to give his mum a hard time, which is quite funny, but there we go. So, where were we? I've just been running around with him now. If that's not treason, yeah, that's right, we're talking about treason. So, question time. Have you managed to create anything using Bitwig's Polygrid or FXGrid yet that you couldn't have created with Bitwig's native devices and modulators? I'm having lots of fun messing around in the grid, but every time I create something, if I'm honest with myself, I probably could have created it in half the time outside the grid. Am I just not getting deep enough yet, or is it the digital equivalent of Eurocrack, i.e. fun but ultimately a long and complicated way of creating something relatively basic? Yeah, I mean, it kind of is, to be honest, and I don't mean any disrespect by that, because I love Eurorack stuff as well, or modular stuff in general. So I understand that with modular stuff you can choose who creates the oscillator, and not all oscillators are identical, let's be honest, particularly when it comes to square waves and pulse width waves. And even sine waves, I guess. And especially when it comes to effects, you know, there are some really unique effects out there in the modular world. Similarly, with the grid, you know, your imagination is the only limitation. But I think sometimes people need to think back to basics. And when you really, truly think about it, there's really only a finite few types of sounds that the human brain can distinguish from each other. And because of that, much like I've said several times in the past, people talk about their favourite reverb or their favourite compressor or whatever, and it adds character. But truth be known, and there are exceptional circumstances where those things are very important, and I'm not disputing that at all. However, for the vast majority of cases, let's be honest, when you're compressing a kick drum and it's covered in snare drums and hats and vocals and bass lines and lead melodies and effects sweeps and white noise and God knows what else, are you really going to hear that difference in a compressor on a kick drum? No, of course you're not. Similarly, when it comes to the grid or modular stuff, it's more about the journey than the destination. So it's hard to put into words because I don't want to speak in absolute terms, because the fact is I'm positive that there must be things that you can create in the grid that you couldn't possibly create just stacking up effects and whatever, using stock sounds and whatever it is in Bitwig or a VST. But for the vast majority of things, there probably isn't a great deal of difference, and even with those differences, they're probably not very noticeable. So I hope that makes sense. So yeah, there we go. That's kind of my view. However, aside from all of that, I do think things like the grid and Max MSP and Pure Data and all of these modular object-based programming, audio programming software kits, I do think there's huge educational value for not just the education community, but actually for us, for the nerds, for the people who just want to learn how a synth works or whatever. There are things we can learn in there that we maybe wouldn't learn otherwise. So for example, you could easily buy a compressor and play around with the settings of input gain, output gain, thresholds, limiter, whatever, and play with those dials. But do you really understand fundamentally what it's doing, what each component within that compressor, what it's really doing to the signal of a sound? Whereas if you were to try to recreate a compressor using different techniques to recreate the effect of a compressor, I suppose I should say, if you were to do that inside the grid, you're far more likely to learn how exactly a compressor works, and also how a compressor differentiates between whatever it is you're building. And I think that can be hugely educational, because then later on in our musical career, we might be asked, oh, can you do X, Y, and Z? And you're going to approach it with a slightly different mindset than you would have done otherwise. So I think as much as you're not wrong, there's also a much bigger picture to look at with these things, I think. So there we go. Deadly Custard, Hive 5, high five to you. Hey Dom, question on reverb. Is there any difference between putting a reverb directly on a sound at a low wetness versus putting a reverb on a separate track with the input coming from the sound on full wet but turned down in volume? Makes sense? Yes, it does. And weirdly, I had a conversation with Ollie Portamento, Gorp, at AD, and we were talking about this because he was saying he spoke to, I don't know, someone who was showing him the difference and using a specific reverb within that example. And Ollie was saying you wouldn't believe the difference it made. One of them sounded just so much warmer. I think it was using it in line of the channel. Felt warmer, if I remember rightly, and I'm trying to work out the maths in my head, and I think that's the way it should be. So, yes, there is a difference. And I sat there, and because he was saying I can't work out how, why it shouldn't be different, and I sat there thinking, yeah, why would it be different? And then it occurred to me that actually it should be different, and the reason that I came up with in my head, I could be totally wrong here, so don't quote me on this, but a lot of it depends on gain staging. If you think, for example, Pan's law, if you want to get proper nerdy look into Pan's law on different workstations and how they approach it, the idea is that if something is panned to the center, so it's mixed left right 50-50, it will be at one gain, let's call it 0 dB. If you pan it hard right or pan it hard left or whatever, the gain will actually fluctuate depending on where the dial is, because a lot of that is to do with filters and crossovers and the way signal paths change. It just is a thing, basically. It's Pan's law. I've never really studied it, so I don't, it is what it is. I just know it's there. So if you think of that, there's also going to be a difference with gain staging when it comes to your reverb being inline, in channel. It's only allowing an input level of, say, 20%, let's call it 20% wet. It's only allowing 20% of the input signal to be affected and drop out. And if it's inline in the same channel, the end channel, your master channel, is only receiving that single signal, which is uninterrupted signal, and will maintain a steady gain. Whereas if you double up your channels, even though one's 100% wet, one's 100% dry, and you're only lowering the gain of whatever, you're still adding gain, which means your master, technically, depending on how the DAW does its gain staging and everything, then technically you're going to be raising a little bit louder. So there will actually be a very slight difference, which means when you're running it inline, you're more likely to be getting some sort of saturation, which will probably give you third harmonics, which is what we call warm saturation. And so so that's kind of my way of thinking about it. So there is and probably should be a slight subtle difference. But again, in conclusion, much like the previous question, if you're throwing in kicks and snares and hi-hats and everything everywhere, is anybody really going to notice? Probably not. The only time that's really going to make a huge difference is if you're doing an acoustic singer-songwriter vocal grand piano recording and you're then adding reverb and whatever saturation post-production. That's the only time it's really going to make a noticeable difference, I suppose. And then finally, Yanis Lokmelis, Hive, high five. That is it for this week, my friends. Thank you very much for making it this far into the video. To comment this far, to prove even that you've made it this far into the video, I'm trying to read and talk at the same time. That's never a good idea. I am going to say comment the word street, because there's a video here that says 11 minutes of pure street photography. So there we go. Street is the keyword for this week. Everyone have a great weekend. Please do get involved in the Patreon. That's starting to sort of take a bit of shape now, which is good. Otherwise, come check us out at the Dom Kane Producer Group on Facebook. And aside from all of that, either way, have a good weekend, and I'll see you this time next week. Cheers.